Yesterday, a full-fledged eco-terrorist riot broke out in New Brunswick. Anti-fracking activists in Rexton, New Brunswick, threw Molotov cocktails at police, and they torched at least 5 police vehicles, and police also found other explosives on the scene. Police were finally enforcing a 2-week-old court injunction against the eco-protesters who had defied the law of the land for months. Police went in with a show of force. Estimates report up to 200 officers, but they didn't actually use any deadly force. They used beanbag guns, which knock a person down. They used tear gas, which drive people out. But it was the eco-rioters themselves who used true violence, including, according to police, firing real guns at them. RCMP arrested at least 40 rioters and charged them with everything from firearms offenses to uttering threats to intimidation to mischief to simply not abiding by a court injunction. I'm not sure why they didn't also lay charges of terrorism, because the riot, this crime spree that's actually been terrorizing New Brunswick for a year, has a political purpose to stop lawful natural gas exploration in the province. Isn't that the definition of terrorism? Using violence or the threat of violence to get a political change through the promise of more violence, unless you make a change? Well, New Brunswick's democratically elected government has decided to allow exploration for natural gas found in shale rock. It's the biggest economic boom in the United States right now, and the same rock formations are in New Brunswick. So a company called SWN Resources Canada, a subsidiary of Southwestern Energy, has been exploring the shale from the surface using seismic technology to take a high-tech look at what's under the ground. That's not just lawful, it is severely normal. It's how you find pretty much anything under the ground, not just oil and gas, but any mining too. They're looking for natural gas trapped in shale a mile or so underground. If they find it, they might drill for it. And they'll probably use a commonplace technology called fracking. Fracking may sound dramatic, but it's actually severely normal too. It's been done over 1.1 million times throughout the United States and hundreds of thousands of times in Canada too since the 1940s. It's so common, so normal, that in fact about 90% of all oil and gas wells in North America are fracked. It's just how you do it. It's a week-long process to stimulate an oil or gas well a mile or two underground to crack open the shale rock to let more oil and gas out. And in the more than 1 million times wells have been fracked before, never, not even once, has there even been a report of environmental problems affecting groundwater caused by fracking. Not once in over 1 million times doing it. Here's Obama's first EPA chief testifying about that fact to Congress.
Is there any evidence that hydraulic fracturing, however, can affect aquifers and water supplies?
There is evidence that it can certainly affect them. I am not aware of any proven case where the fracking process itself affected water, although there are investigations ongoing.
Oh, believe me, the EPA would squawk if they found one. They have not found a single case. But that's allegedly the cause of these riots, because Southwestern wants to look for shale gas. They're not even fracking now. They're just looking for shale. But this somehow is so offensive to these activists that they are willing to riot. This isn't just a little protest that got into fisticuffs. This isn't like a spontaneous bar fight. Molotov cocktails, you know what those are? They're glass bottles filled with gasoline or another highly flammable fluid and stuffed with a cloth wick, soaked in fuel, and you light the wick and it starts to burn. It's like a hand grenade. You have a few moments before you have to throw it, and when it lands, instead of exploding into metal shrapnel, it explodes into glass shrapnel. The bottle breaks, and it's like a firebomb. That's what torched these 5 police cars. Sorry, that just doesn't happen when an everyday parade goes wrong. That's not a Stanley Cup celebration gone rogue. That is a planned, deliberate, paramilitary-style preparation by radicals contemplating exactly what they're doing, getting their equipment and supplies in order and lying in wait to ambush the police. That is as premeditated as it comes. And that is exactly what these rioters did. Of course, like many other terrorists, they hid behind the skirts of women and children, not just to pretend that they were less evil than they were, but to increase the risk of a PR disaster for the police. We've seen this 100 times when Palestinian terrorists fire rockets at Israel, literally firing rockets from schools or other civilian areas. They're using their own people as human shields, putting their own people at risk knowingly, either to limit the Israeli response or to cause a PR disaster if, the response has one false step. Here's an example of that. Look.
Ask for something. You want to ask for something? Bring on. Go ahead, let him go. See what happens. See what the happens. You want another officer to go down? Huh?
This is a camera.
No, you.
It's a camera. It's a camera. Get your gun off me.
No, you don't do that.
It's 2 cameras.
Why were women and children there? Children sleeping in tents there in a protest, along with extremist militants armed with Molotov cocktails and guns and explosives. Why were any of them out there in defiance of a court injunction? This was not the first riot, by the way. It was the biggest. But earlier this year on the show, we showed you a picture of a seismic truck owned by Southwestern that was hijacked and torched in an act of brazen political arson. I'm sorry, how is that different from terrorism? Well, it's not different from terrorism. It is terrorism against Southwestern, against the oil and gas industry. It's eco-terrorism. It's I don't know more terrorism. You don't believe me? Well, let me refresh your memory. Again, a video I showed you back in the summer by Clayton Thomas Mueller, a Canadian Indian who works for various U.S.-based anti-fossil fuel foundations, including the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. They back his group, the Indigenous Environmental Network. Here, you can see his organization as one of the recipients of U.S. anti-oil and gas money in their campaign document right there. Well, here's this U.S.-paid anti-oil and gas lobbyist announcing on Parliament Hill that this summer a militant war against oil and gas would begin. Look.
Network known as Defenders of the Land, a network of the most radical, frontline, land-based indigenous struggles in this country that they call Canada, to assist in the launch, in the implementation, in the promotion, in the raising of awareness about this thing called Sovereignty Summer.
That was the moment where I Don't Know More announced it was going to get violent. And yeah, he just happened to announce his target list too, including shale gas in New Brunswick. Look.
Things like the tar sands in Alberta, and things like fracking in New Brunswick, and things like drilling in the Arctic for oil, or clear-cutting forests in Barrier Lake Algonquin territory just north of us. Those kinds of economic development would not be possible if this government adhered to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
So what you've got here is a merger between Aboriginal extremists like Clayton Thomas Mueller, speaking in the name of I Don't Know More, and environmental activists with their big U.S. money, like the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, which pays him. This is new. Big U.S. money using Aboriginal frontmen. Of course they are. Could you imagine if a pasty white, vegetarian, billionaire trust fund rich kid, some fifth-generation Rockefeller who won the genetic lottery by being born into a family whose great-great-great-grandfather happened to be the world's richest man? Could you imagine if some rich kid like that from New York came up to New Brunswick and said, "Excuse me, I'd like you to shut down your economy, please"? We'd laugh him out of town. But these pasty billionaire rich kids are smart, or at least their hired guns are, and they have a deliberate strategy of camouflaging themselves, pretending to be Canadian, by hiring Canadian frontmen and lobbyists with a special emphasis on hiring Indians. Again, this is not my theory, it is a fact. Here is page 36 of the campaign plan of Clayton Thomas Mueller's boss, the Rockefeller Brothers. You can see right there in New York, they decided they needed to hire essentially Indian actors to Canadianize and Indianize their activities up here. And it works, doesn't it? Because Canadians have a sense of guilt, some of it legitimate, about Aboriginal people. So we're reluctant to crack down on organized Indian crime as opposed to organized Hells Angels crime or mafia crime. So it's not just our social guilt, it's our politicians' fear. Oh, they remember the Oka standoff where heavily armed Mohawk warriors stared down the Canadian forces and a Quebec policeman was murdered. And they remember Ipperwash, where the opposite happened, where the police accidentally killed an Indian protester, and the PR consequences from the media party have made it politically dangerous for any policeman ever since to enforce the law if the criminal in question is holding up an Indian feather, an eagle feather, or flying a flag with the Mohawk warriors on. I mean, the environmentalists love to do that. Remember when I went out to the 6-day environmentalist occupation of the Enbridge pumping station in Westover, Ontario? They hired a few Indian actors to come to Indianize their very white protest. Look.
Want to talk to me, Floyd?
No, I'll listen to her. I'll listen to her.
Okay, does she tell you what to do?
Yeah.
So she's sort of colonizing your mind.
I'm not a spokesman here. I'm just a supporter. So I'll listen to what they got to say.
How do you feel about a young white girl telling an Aboriginal man he can't speak?
I think I might.
Oh, and she came and tried to show that she was as dark as him because she had a rich girl's tan. Yeah, those Indians there, Floyd and Ruby Montour, they had no clue why they were there, other than as a splash of color. They're organized with that rich white girl named Alicia Patron, college grad. She works for a U.S.-funded environmental lobby group, Environmental Defense, and the Sierra Club, too. She didn't even hide her racial frame of mind. Their role wasn't to talk. Their role was to provide Indian cover for her U.S. employers. It's working. There's no other way to describe it. If you are an ordinary criminal and you block a street in downtown of a Canadian city, you will be arrested on site by police. But if you call it a drumming circle and block off downtown Winnipeg, as happened yesterday, the police will actually hold back traffic for you, just like they did during the big I don't know where protests in January that blocked railway tracks too. Police are scared. They're not actually scared of a bunch of losers with drums. They're scared of politically correct inquisitors, either from politically correct police brass or the media, who will pillory them for being racist if they uphold the law in a racially neutral manner. That is, the non-racist police are being forced into having a racial double standard by the real racists who want two sets of laws in this country. It's absurd. And foreign environmentalists are making their move right now. Earlier this week, Greenpeace, a foreign multinational headquartered in Amsterdam, paid for protesters to break into an oil pumping station in Burnaby, BC. They broke in, they trespassed, and they put the facility in danger. Frankly, they caused a risk of an oil spill. They're not trained. They have no clue what they were doing. But police came and just let them go. No arrests, no charges. Greenpeace were laughing. They got back on their ship, the Rainbow Warrior, in Vancouver Harbor, ready to go trespass somewhere else for fun and profit. What the hell? We have foreign foundations paying for Aboriginal frontmen to be the colorful face of anti-oil and gas extremism. They don't even hide it. And our police are so politically scared, they now even let rich white kids break the law in the light of day and walk away without arrest, as in Burnaby. I mean, here is the mighty Sierra Club of Canada. It's a branch plant of the U.S. Sierra Club. They were on that Rockefeller Brothers Fund anti-oil and gas campaign plan too, you'll recall. For some bizarre reason, the Sierra Club in Canada has, it's a lobby group, but they actually have charitable status here in Canada, as if there's some homeless shelter or food bank. They're not. They're lobbyists, and they were cheering on the rioters last night. Here, look for yourself. Here's some of their tweets. There are some truly offensive pictures of the RCMP abusing their power in New Brunswick today, one of them said. Well, so the rioters are the good guys and the RCMP are abusing their power? How? By enforcing the law and a court order after 2 weeks of showing patience and with beanbag guns? Or this one? What we are seeing today is the public footing the bill in order to enforce private ownership over natural resources. Well, that's just weird. The resources in New Brunswick, as in the rest of Canada, are owned by the government in the name of the Queen, controlled by the provincial government. But the Sierra Club thinks that's inappropriate, or the police shouldn't remove illegal rioters, or whatever. I don't know if they even know what they mean. But this is a U.S.-funded lobby group with Canadian charitable status cheering for eco-terrorists. And here's their boss, John Bennett. He's formerly a staffer to Elizabeth May. What does he have to say? Well, let me read his tweet. He says, here's how Canada consults First Nations, fracking, the picture there. He's a nut. He thinks those rioters represent the lawful expression of Indian political will. And he thinks that the police enforcing the law are illegitimate. And that's the only way our elected government ever engages with Aboriginals, with guns. He's a kook with charitable status, taking foreign money to attack Canadian jobs and to cheer on rioters. Well, what about Indian leaders in Canada? Not the leader of the New Brunswick Indian band, the Micmacs, Chief Aaron Sock, who was arrested at the riot himself. But what about the so-called national leaders here? Well, Grand Chief Sean Atleo, who generally has been moderate and constructive, he actually wrote a letter to Chief Sock. He said, today's actions and numerous arrests, including members of the Chief and Council, are a direct affront to your efforts at reaching a diplomatic solution. Please know that we and First Nations across the country stand proudly in solidarity with you and your community. Solidarity with the community, fine. But does that also include solidarity with the rioters? With those who were arrested for violence? And what does that mean, a diplomatic solution? Are we pretending that just because an Indian band uses the phrase First Nation, that they're actually a sovereign nation, like a separate and independent country with an ambassador to Canada or something? Well, why, yes, that is the leading theory amongst Indian extremists, that they are some sort of freestanding country, not Canadian at all. Here's Atleo's chief competitor within Indian politics, a nut named Pam Palmater. She ran against Atleo to be the big chief, but she lost. But she's been trying to undermine Atleo ever since. She calls for radicalism. She actually struts around wearing military-style camouflage fatigues half the time. It's quite weird. A fancy rich girl professor in Toronto who lives off reserve, like a rich white girl who flies first class around the country, pretending to be in league with poor oppressed Indians who actually do live on the reserve. She's a fake that way. A rich girl in the city pretending to be a tough girl on the reserve. But she has a following, desperate youth who prefer her destructive message of militancy instead of, oh, say something harder to do, like, how about we fix up your reserve and build jobs? It's always easier to blame Whitey, isn't it, Pam? Except for on payday. And that's what she did on the CBC yesterday, naturally. Here, look, a few clips of her, look.
Well, it's actually been going on for months. The Southwestern Energy Company made a deal with the province of New Brunswick to come in and do hydro-fracking testing over 2.5 million hectares of land in New Brunswick. No consultation with First Nations, no consent, no information. And so First Nations have been trying to portray their views on this, that this is not safe for the environment.
No consultation, no consent, but that's just not true. It's the law of all of Canada that you need consent to go on someone's property. Here, I mean, this is from Southwestern's own information site. You just cannot go on the land without permission. It's against the law. Quote, we operate with the greatest respect for landowners and surrounding communities. For any activity that requires access to private property, landowner permission is required. For this permission, a permit agent will meet with each landowner to explain the planned activity, answer questions, and request signed approval. In exchange for this permission, Southwestern will pay a fee based on access to the property and planned level of activity. This is how it works everywhere in Canada. But hey, what does Pam Palmer know? She lives in downtown Toronto, GTA area, in the city. She just makes stuff up. It's not like the CBC is going to challenge her on her facts. How about this? Look at this.
Around 7:30 in the morning, 200 RCMP officers, some in riot gear, fully armed with assault rifles, came to the protest and started being provocative, swearing at First Nations, saying that this land isn't theirs, firing rubber bullets and so on and so forth. And all of these protesters were unarmed.
Boy, it's almost like she was there. Of course, she wasn't. She was doing that via Skype from Manitoba, but testify, girl. Fact is, the police did not fire rubber bullets, and the protesters were not unarmed. They had guns and bombs and Molotov cocktails. Look at this.
That the laws in New Brunswick include the constitutionally protected treaties. And our treaties, unlike other treaties, did not cede any land. All of those lands and resources still belong to the Mi'kmaq.
But that just is not true. That is just not true. There is no Indian sovereignty, no Indian title to the land. That does not exist in law. This was confirmed, just one example in New Brunswick, in the 1983 Supreme Court of Canada case called the Queen versus Gilbert Smith. A non-Indian guy named Gilbert Smith lived on land that the Indians said was theirs. But he said he bought the land. The federal government tried to kick him off, saying it was Indian land and he was white, so get the hell off. But the Supreme Court said the land was indeed sold to him and the federal government had no right to it, and neither did the Indian band, for Indians had properly sold it to him. Now, I'm studying the history of New Brunswick Indian treaties. They do not have treaty rights to land. They don't have a constitutional or legal right to it, certainly not one that trumps the New Brunswick government. They've had licenses to occupy the land, true, but those are rent licenses. They don't trump Queen Elizabeth's law. Pam Palmer is just kooky. It's like those Calgary free men of the land, you know, who claim they don't have to obey trespass laws because they're independent little countries. They occupy, you know, apartments and as squatters. No, you have to obey the law. You're just a kook. Just like Pam Palmer's theory is kooky. Oh, and I do mean kooky. Look at this.
First of all, the timing. 200 RCMP officers are sent in with snipers the day after the speech from the throne is given and the UN rapporteur investigating Canadian violations against Indigenous peoples has left the country. So the timing's more than coincidental.
Pam went full conspiracy theory. Pam, you never go full conspiracy theory. That is the talk of a crazy woman. But there she is on the CBC as a role model and a spokesman for Indians, egging on the violence, smearing the police, cooking up bizarre fantasy theories of Indian bands being some sort of little diplomatic islands in the middle of Canada where regular laws don't apply. If you're a young Indian on a reserve, frustrated by poverty and social dysfunction, you need role models talking about jobs and prosperity and taking personal responsibility for your life and getting your act together. Not someone promoting blame storming, always pointing at Whitey, always preaching a philosophy of grievance. It's worshiping victimhood. It's telling young Indian people that Whitey is out to get them. The system is unfair at best, criminal at worst. It is sowing the seeds of violence and despair. And the CBC gives this kook a platform. And Sean Atleo himself obviously feels the need to mimic at least the basics of that philosophy too, just to keep up with her. And the irony of it is that Palmer is about as Indian as I am. I mean, she lives in the city, in a white neighborhood, making a six-figure check at a white university, flying first class. Oh, but she wears camouflage outfits while she does it, so she's real. This is eco-terrorism with a rented Aboriginal faith. Shame on those foreign foundations that pay for this anarchy, and double shame on Indian leaders who are all too willing to let their own people become cannon fodder for the foreign-funded war on Canadian oil and gas instead of promoting an ideology of harmony and prosperity.